Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of today's webinars is safeguarding during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have a large number of you, so a very warm welcome this morning. Please do ask your questions at any time. We'll do our level best to be able to answer them, but given the sheer numbers of governors that we have on the webinar this morning, we may not be able to get through all of them. So if we don't manage that, we will actually answer you via an email after the webinar is over. Just a couple of housekeeping points. You can hopefully see the GoTo dashboard on your screen. If you can't, there's a little white arrow in an orange box floating on the top right-hand side of your screen. If you click that, it will open the toolbar. If you could just locate the little hand icon there and raise your hand if you can hear us now. It will just give us an indication that everybody's got their volume control sorted. Lovely, I can see most people raising their hand, which is great. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll put your hands down for you now to save you doing that. That's lovely. And as I say, you have the little grey toolbar there, which little grey bar rather in the toolbar with the word questions on it. At any time you have a question, just click on that and type your question in there, and we'll do our level best to answer it, as I say. My name is Steve Barker, and I'm on the left-hand side of the screen that's in front of you now, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning, and I'm located in Surrey and Linda's down in West Sussex, and hopefully you're there on the other end of the line, Linda.
I am. Good morning, everyone.
Lovely. And between us, Linda and I will guide you through the webinar this morning, but as we say, most important thing, this is your webinar, so please ask your questions at any stage. So as far as the aims of today's session are concerned, what we want to do is really clarify the most important key point, and that is that governance has not stopped because of the pandemic. Governance continues, and of course a key element of governance is always going to be safeguarding. Therefore, our oversight, our strategic oversight as governors of safeguarding during the reduced opening of our schools does actually continue. Now, I'm aware there might be one or two people who where their schools are closed at the moment, but the vast majority of schools in the country are at least partially open right now, so that's the assumption that we're taking. What we also want to do is make sure there's clear understanding about how the current crisis can actually impact on children and young people's vulnerability in our schools, and some of the things that governors need to be very aware of in terms of their monitoring of that situation. And also we want to ensure that everybody involved in governance actually has the confidence to continue holding their schools to account for effective safeguarding, as well as all of their other responsibilities. But obviously safeguarding is our focus this morning, not just for the last 12 weeks or so, but also in the coming months as well. A fairly broad outline there for us, but as I say, we'll get into the specifics in 1 or 2 moments. I think everybody is aware that we are operating in a very different situation to what we normally are. We've moved from the government logo at the top left of your screen there, the stay at home protecting the NHS to save lives, to a situation now where we are staying alert to control the virus, but still with the ultimate aim of saving lives. And of course, you know, the idea of saving lives, protecting the NHS, or controlling the virus, whichever we want to focus on, these are all fundamental to safeguarding, and a lot of our safeguarding issues at the moment should be revolving around this whole idea of, are we ensuring that children, young people and staff in our schools are safe right now? And we have lots of government guidance at the moment, as I'm sure you'll be very aware. The most significant piece of guidance for us, I think, right now in terms of safeguarding is this screenshot I've got of the page of the .gov.uk website, which is on in front of you right now. And This particular guidance was first issued on the 27th of March, and this really outlines for schools, including for governing bodies, and that's all state-funded schools, so academies as well as maintained schools, highlights what the expectations that the DfE has for us in terms of our overview of safeguarding during the corona crisis. And there is a banner which was actually put on this in the last couple of weeks. It was actually sneaked on to say this guidance is applicable to the 31st of May and will be reviewed before the 1st of June. I did check it just before we came on air. It has not been updated yet, but we are anticipating that if the planned partial opening of schools goes ahead for the 1st of June, and of course that's still in debate at the moment, then we will see this guidance be updated in some form or other during that time. Can see there's a question coming from, just before we move on, from James. Can you clarify what relates to sixth form colleges? All settings here are covered, so it relates to all state-funded settings, so sixth form colleges, early years settings, as well as schools that are offering the national curriculum, and of course academies as well. So I hope that answers your question, James.
Steve, before we move on, I think it's just worth saying that in that original guidance that was published just after schools went into a closure phase, there was still an expectation, as you said, that there would be some children in school. So there were still some measures that we would recognise in the current situation around all of those safeguarding conversations. And hopefully since the 27th of March, many governors listening to the webinar this morning will have attended a virtual meeting, will have been aware that some of this is being implemented in their school already. So a lot of what has happened since the 27th of March is in a way preparing us for understanding what comes next when there are more children in school. And so the need to follow the guidance in this way and keep track of what that looks like with larger numbers is following on. But they were still talking the 27th of March about clusters, and now we've got ideas around pods and bubbles. But the measures were in their infancy, but hopefully governors will and board members will recognise some of those elements from the planning that's happening now.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing I would just comment, we've got quite a few questions coming through at the moment relating to what we think about the government's plans to be honest, folks, it's not for us to actually give our personal opinions on government plans at the moment. That's not really what the focus of today's webinar is actually all about. Lots of people asking questions about how those decisions are going to be made, etc. But this isn't the focus of this morning's webinar. Linda and I are here representing Better Governor this morning on behalf of Governors for Schools. We're in fact running a webinar later on today, actually on the risk assessment of returning to school. So we are focusing on safeguarding here with Governors for Schools this morning, and so forgive me if I don't get into those questions about liability for people contracting for disease when schools reopen, etc. But that's not really what our focus is at this point in time. So if we move on and just focus on the safeguarding guidance, what the government has actually stated, or in fact a lot of this is reiteration of what we already knew, of course, but keeping children safe, which is the key document in terms of defining what responsibilities of governing boards are in schools with regard to safeguarding, as well as everybody else's responsibilities, that remains in force, and of course it is statutory guidance, therefore should be referred to by all of us in schools. You may be aware that a consultation had actually been launched prior to lockdown on a new version of Keeping Children Safe in Education, which was due for launch in September. That consultation has actually been withdrawn now. It's actually been put on ice, so we're not quite sure what's going to happen on that now. So the 2019 version that came into effect in early September last year, that is still the version of Keeping Children Safe that we refer to. And a quote from the government guidance there: it remains essential that as far as possible they continue, that means schools of course, to be safe places for children. So this is just really an overall consideration for governors as well as for head teachers and leadership teams in schools. You know, health and safety, general safeguarding has to be a consideration throughout the opening of our schools, whatever that looks like at the moment. And the government is actually reminding us that children's safety is still of paramount importance. They've highlighted 5 specific aspects. I'm going to come on and talk about those on the next slide, if I may. And again, most of these are common sense. The one that I think is probably the most significant one I'll highlight when we get to it. The best interests of children must always come first. Well, I think all of us in governance, hopefully many of us became governors because we fervently believe that anyway. But you know, no matter what other concerns there are, what other constraints we may find that we're up against, and again, this is particularly relevant when we're contemplating potential reopening of schools on a larger scale at the moment. It is the best interest of children that we have a statutory duty to put above all else.
I think I might just add there, Steve, it is the best interest of all children, not just the ones that are in school now or maybe in school in a phased return. It's of all children in your school. So children who are at home as well, the safeguarding responsibility is still there. There is still a requirement to make sure that they are being provided with as safe an option, and we've still got that, the school's still got that oversight of those children's best interests.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Linda, and I think the danger for us is there's an awful lot of operational activity in our schools at the moment, and we can't lose sight that whatever's going on in schools, the safety of children has to be the primary concern without any doubt whatsoever. And on that front, of course, when we're talking safeguarding, we always talk about the culture of vigilance that we should be aiming to establish in our schools. That means that if any member of staff that's in school, no matter what that staffing rota might look like, any member of staff in schools should still be, if they have any concerns at all, should be absolutely acting on those immediately. That does not change, and even when schools, if they return on or after the 1st of June, that will still, even in those varied operating conditions, that will still be the prime concern. But any concerns at all, sorry, there are a few too many concerns in that sentence, but any concerns that there are must be passed on to designated safeguarding leads immediately. And the one bit that I think a lot of schools were concerned about when the lockdown first came into force, and we had reduced staffing in our schools reflecting the reduced number of pupils, the expectation in normal times is that the designated safeguarding lead, or DSL as we're saying here, should be in school at all time, or the deputy should. The DfE relaxed the guidance a little bit and actually changed, said should be available, and of course that meant that they could be available on the end of a phone line, so didn't actually have to be in school every day. And again, that's something that I think was quite reassuring for a lot of schools in the early days of the lockdown. One thing that we've spent a lot of time answering questions on in our help desk is that recruitment per se can go ahead during lockdown. Schools will still be contemplating about, are they going to get any resignations between now and the 31st of May? And if they are, then they might actually need to contemplate about filling those prior to September. And of course, we don't actually know at this point in time whether schools will be fully operational by then or not. But whatever recruitment is going on in schools, and again, we would always recommend that governors should ensure that schools are engaging with their appropriate HR supplier. But whatever recruitment is going on, it is for us as governors to ensure that that recruitment is following all safer recruitment guidelines and statutory responsibilities. And the last point on this slide, online protection for children is a priority. Obviously, one of the perhaps unforeseen circumstances that has actually come up as a result of the lockdown has been children and young people are spending far more time online than has actually been the case historically. A lot of that, of course, is engaged in online learning, which schools have actually put in place, but children have actually got probably more free time than they would normally have, and because the restrictions have been in their homes. And so all of the evidence suggests that far more time has been spent on social networking, on gaming, etc. And that in itself does present risks to children and young people. So again, something that we should be very mindful of as governors.
So at the moment we have a situation where, and we are talking about before the 1st of June, so as now from the 20th of March when schools closed to the whole population, there was an expectation that schools would remain open for a much smaller group of children to provide a childcare option, essentially for these groups of children. So children with an education and healthcare plan, which we would know as an EHCP. So those children, provided that it was safe for them to come into school in terms of their health, they were expected to still have a provision in place for them to support them. And then this much wider group, which tends to be the group that we talk about more often, is the children of key workers. And this guidance about who is a key worker has been expanded over a period of time, but we would recognise our NHS staff, those staff that are working in creating and distributing medicines, the distribution and retail of food, and some delivery workers, postmen, firemen, policemen, teachers. So it's quite a wide group. We have seen initially in most schools that the numbers were quite flexible, and with further work opportunities being opened in the last week or so, these numbers tend to be showing an increase. So again, the planning for that, it may be that it's changed over time. And then there needs to be, of course, sufficient staff in to cover the needs of those children that are coming in under those two groups. And there needs to be some provision made with the staff that maybe are not in school, or that a mixture of both, that learning continues. And I know some staff have been attending school in order to deliver some of that online learning that Steve mentioned before. But in all of these groups of children, there is a requirement that safeguarding must continue to be that top level priority. That first thing that schools think about is, are we doing the right things in the best interest of all these pupils, covering this multitude of ways in which we're working at the moment?
And just a couple of questions before we move on there, folks. Question here from Beverly. Beverly saying, how as governors can we be assured that safeguarding remains robust by conducting our meetings remotely? I think in general terms, this comes down to the fundamental role of governance, Beverly. Linda and I would always say you can summarise governance in 4 words. That is what we do as governors, is we ensure by seeking assurance. So we don't have to go into schools to seek assurance. We should be asking our head teachers to confirm what arrangements are still in place and what new arrangements have actually been devised to ensure the protection and safeguarding of children during the coronavirus. So that doesn't really change, and certainly we've actually been issuing guidance to a lot of the schools through Better Governor, and also through the service that we run at Strictly Education, in terms of what agendas might look like, what head teacher reports might look like at the current time. And lots of schools, lots of local authorities will have access to that information through their providers. So there is guidance out there should you need it, but certainly our role as governors is about asking those key questions. And that includes, of course, what relating to the content of head teacher reports at the moment. Not that they have to be written, they can be verbal, but we can ask our head teachers to comment on what changes, what amendments to safeguarding they've actually made during this situation. And there's also another question here from Gordon. Gordon's saying, how do we monitor children and young people's online gaming, etc., if this is being done at home? It's not about monitoring per se what individual children, individual families are doing, Gordon, but I would suggest schools do have a responsibility, and this is something that as governors we would want to be seeking assurance on, but schools are reminding parents and also reminding children and young people of how to stay safe online, how to build their resilience, how to recognise when perhaps they are vulnerable to being abused or influenced in an inappropriate way online, and what to do in that situation. Just because learning is going on from home doesn't mean it does not continue to include PSHE, personal, social and health education, and we would see that very much as coming under that. So again, from a governance point of view, I would be expecting governors to seek assurance from head teachers that there is still appropriate messaging going both to parents and carers and to pupils on how to stay safe online, particularly when there are definitely lots of sources of evidence saying that children are spending far more time online.
And as Steve said, I would absolutely concur with that. He has given you two excellent questions to ask. What has been provided for parents so that they understand the increased risks, and what has been provided for students to ensure that they understand what they need to do to keep themselves safe, because part of the learning process is about building resilience and knowledge in children so that they actually become proportionately more responsible for their own actions and safety.
Okay, so Linda's mentioned a little bit about vulnerable children already, and again we've had one or two people point out that the government have updated guidance in the last couple of days. There's been lots of different bits of updating, but one of the key pieces of updated guidance was on vulnerable children earlier this week, in terms of extending not just the definition but actually extending the category here, and again, as Linda mentioned again a little bit earlier, also about key workers and who falls into that particular category. Vulnerable children, again, children can be vulnerable for a whole variety of different reasons, of course. But children are expected to be in school if they fit into any one of these categories. Firstly, if they're assessed as being in need, and that means there has been a formal assessment by Children's Services, so they have either a children in need plan, which means that they are being monitored by social care, or of course if they have an individual child protection plan, which means that they are at risk of significant harm. Those children absolutely should, if at all possible, be in school at the moment. Children are also defined as being vulnerable if they have an educational healthcare plan, or an EHCP as it's often referred to in school. And I think as governors, most of us will be aware that this is a difficult tightrope to walk. Some schools will have children and young people whose vulnerability because of their needs means that the staffing requirements to safely accommodate them in school perhaps are being compromised at the moment. So schools will be having discussions about those. As with everything, it's not for us as governors to get involved in individual situations and to know children's names, etc. But it is for us to be aware of the sort of discussions, the sort of considerations that are actually being held. And certainly as governors, we should be seeking assurance that wherever possible, the groups of children represented in those first two bullet points on this slide are being accommodated and their needs are actually being met in school at the current time.
And again,
sorry, Linda.
I was going to say, in meetings that governors may have had virtually, I know from many governors reporting back to me that their heads are concerned about some of the children that didn't fit neatly into the original planning, for whom, as head teachers, they remained concerned the longer they weren't in school. So I think that governors may well be aware that this was an area where heads would like to have seen some change in the guidance.
Yep, absolutely agree. And again, we will be watching what happens there, but that may change a little bit more as time goes on. We've got a couple of questions coming through here asking about what if these vulnerable children don't turn up. Yeah, absolutely, that is a consideration, of course it is. And if they don't turn up, the schools will be wanting to ask questions, hopefully, you know, what are the reasons for you know, that non-attendance in schools? Is it about transport? Is it about other issues? But schools will hopefully be wanting, also hopefully schools will be wanting to, and hopefully therefore are engaging with the families of those vulnerable children, just to check in on them at least on a weekly basis, but on a fairly regular basis, just to make sure that those children and their families are okay. In the early days, before we had the free school meal voucher scheme set up, there were some real cases of hardship for some of our most vulnerable families, and schools were in almost daily contact with those people just to see what they could actually do to actually help out. So regular communication, regular contact with anybody who falls in this category. And as I said, that third bullet point there is anybody who has been identified as vulnerable by anybody involved in providing care. So this could be the school just realizes there's a family in particular hardship circumstance at the moment, or there's somebody where there are some concerns which perhaps are not shared by the authority at this point in time, but the school is monitoring children's provision. If they are saying they're vulnerable, then the school should be doing everything within its power to ensure that those children are admitted to schools as well.
And remember, this picture is changing. So from the 20th of March onwards, we're not expecting the picture of the identified children on the 20th March being exactly the same as now. Because of the current situation, many families have fallen into a vulnerable category since that time, and for all sorts of reasons, not maybe the traditional ones that we looked at in the past as governors. But I think questions there about how schools know and have been in touch with every child. Some children are engaging with some kind of an online learning platform, and the school can quickly see that they are actually keeping in touch in some way. And for many schools, they would already have put in place very, very careful operational programs to check on all of the children, not just those that we've identified here, but everybody else in case they have fallen into that vulnerable category. Certainly one of the governing boards that I'm on, it was discovered that one single parent had gone down with the coronavirus, and her children hadn't engaged with their learning at all in that time because she simply had been too unwell to do that. But it was only for the school following that up that the needs were recognised and the right support and help was found for that family. And there are many personal stories going on that your schools are dealing with. You are not expected as governors to know what they are, but just to be aware that vulnerability is a changing picture at the moment, and schools are doing an awful lot of work to make sure they pick those up. They're often that first level of, are all our children safe? That has not been forgotten by those heads and teachers who have had those responsibilities in the classrooms before the 20th of March.
And we've got a lot of questions coming through at the moment, and too many for me to name everybody here. But one particular question has come through from Alec, and Alec is saying, just to clarify, if at the end of the day parents of vulnerable children do not cooperate, then nothing can be done. Things can be done. We can't force them to come to school, although certainly those who have child protection plans where there's a named social worker, that can be part of the plan, that those children must come to school, and that will be monitored by children's social services. But certainly if children are not in school, and again we've got a couple of questions, one from Gillian talking about children missing in education, etc. It is still, as Linda said, the school's responsibility to follow up. So just because they're not coming to school does not mean there shouldn't be that communication that we've already talked about. So schools do have a duty, and certainly one of the schools where I'm a chair of governor, I know full well that members of school staff have gone and knocked on doors. They've stepped back to maintain social distancing, but they've gone and physically checked up that a child's okay because they haven't had anybody pick the telephone up for whatever reason. And I think we're all aware of that kind of thing can happen. So schools, just because somebody doesn't come to school doesn't mean that's the end of that journey, as Linda said.
And remember, for some children, school is a safer place than being at home. So we mustn't lose sight that we've got a lot of parents who are very anxious about the safety of their children coming back to school, but there are a considerable number of children for whom coming back to school is the lifeline that they're holding on to.
Indeed, and we've got a lot of questions coming through as well on the theme of attendance. How do we monitor the attendance? The government has actually put very specific attendance recording measures in place during the lockdown and the associated school closure programme for all children, not just those vulnerable ones, but for all children who are in school at the moment. And there is a DFE dedicated line where schools report their attendance directly to them. So the daily act in schools of completing attendance registers twice a day, that has actually been suspended for the time being, and schools have a form that they fill in on a daily basis and submit that directly to the DFE. And those of you that monitor the .gov.uk bulletins on education will see that attendance data is published from time to time by the government on that very specific theme. Okay, forgive me if I'm not coming to all of the questions, but we have got a very large number of people on the webinar this morning. We've got lots of questions, so I'm trying to group them together, but we need to press on, otherwise we're going to run out of time. Hopefully the message that's just popped up on the screen there, how do governors know, is something for us to reflect on. Are we asking appropriate questions related to these things that we know our schools should be putting in place, and are we actually getting the answers we should? Because that's what accountability is all about, and accountability has never been more focused on safeguarding than perhaps it is at the moment. Okay, so what I want to do now is launch our first poll of the session this morning, and our first poll is all about what you perceive as being the single most significant safeguarding concern at the current time during the lockdown. And I've launched that poll now, so I'm hoping, unfortunately, we've got a slightly different setup on GoTo this morning. I can't see what you can see, but I'm hoping that poll has actually appeared on your screens at this point in time.
Yes, it has.
Lovely, thank you, Linda. If you would just cast your eyes over those, and I can see we've got about 25% who voted already, which is lovely, thank you. Just while people are filling in that poll, question here from Alan about the potential tension post-June the 1st, if indeed that does become the date when schools return, about parents refusing to send children to school. Government has actually made it clear there will be no consequences to parents. They're actually seeing this as a matter of parental choice at the moment. That does not, of course, detract from any of those comments that we just made about vulnerable children, Alan, so I hope that answers your question. Okay, so we've got about roughly 3/4 of you have voted now, so just a couple more moments there. If you would cast your vote, because I'm going to close that poll in a few moments and share the responses with you. One or two of you seem to be having difficulty voting. If you have got your screen in, sorry, if you've got the presentation in full screen mode, if you momentarily just reduce the view out of full screen mode, that should actually enable you to vote. We discovered that glitch on the system yesterday. Okay, I think that's everybody who's going to vote has actually voted now, so I'll close that poll and then share those results with you. And Linda, do you mind talking to these, because I can't actually see the results anymore?
Absolutely. So if we're looking at the worry about, and you were only restricted to choose the one that was the biggest concern. The children contracting the illness is fairly low down there, as is children spending more time online. I might question the children spending more time online, because I think there is quite a concern by schools that there are some quite serious safeguarding issues that we know in a wider community. Those vulnerable children who are groomed in that way or persuaded in that way are actually more vulnerable there. So that might be something that you want to investigate a little bit more. Indeed, the increase in domestic abuse is not something that we can ignore. There have been a significant number of deaths and there have been a significant number of children. It's a third increase to Childline raising concerns, and so we simply cannot ignore the fact that for some of our families, domestic abuse is has been an escalating problem since they've had to spend more time at home with each other. And then the largest group of you are saying that the biggest concern is around vulnerable children not being in school. And this maybe is where you might want to ask more questions in your virtual meetings around safeguarding, just to reassure yourself that the school has done all it can in order to track and put in place support for those families. It won't always be about the school providing the support, because it's the education offer that the school is responsible for, but often with the most vulnerable children, there are links with other organisations that the school has been working with in partnership, like social workers and the police, and sometimes we can combine the last two, the domestic abuse and vulnerable children not being in school. If you're not going to see in school the results of an incident that has happened, this provided an extra layer of protection when that child was coming to school every day. So certainly this is an interesting picture, because if we would ask parents in our school what would they think their biggest safeguarding concern is, they would probably be thinking about the top one in greater numbers. So I think it's an interesting picture, and it probably differs. We've got a very large group of people on the webinar today, and it probably differs in different areas and different types of contexts for your schools. But if this is backed up by evidence, things that you've seen in your head teachers' reports, conversations and discussions that you've had in school, and you're sure that this is an accurate picture, the next level is, so what is happening about that? Can any of these areas be improved, either in strategic ways or in operational ways? Bearing in mind, of course, that school staff are incredibly under pressure at the moment to formulate their plans for the potential reopening. I presume, Steve, you're looking through some of the questions, and
yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming through on a whole variety of different issues here. Yvonne's making a point that a great concern is what schools do not know about abuse and neglect during this period. Absolutely, Yvonne, that's always the case. Of course, it's you know, very much sort of tip of the iceberg is what comes into school, is what goes on behind closed doors. And again, that's where it's actually very difficult for schools. But if there are concerns, and obviously we know that domestic abuse is on the increase during the current lockdown for fairly obvious reasons, if there are any suspicions that might be happening, then of course schools still have that duty to actually report those concerns. But yeah, it is certainly an ongoing concern for an awful lot of us at the moment. We've got a couple of comments came in about online lessons, etc. I think there are recommendations from government. There are government funded platforms there, like the Oaks Academy, etc. It's not for us to comment on the you know, the pluses and minuses on individual platforms. Lots of people will be making decisions of how to use that. Somebody's put a comment on about the teaching unions being opposed to it. It is for individual schools to decide what they wish to do. Their members can follow the advice of their unions if they wish to do so. When we talk about online learning, we don't just mean a teacher standing in front of a web camera on Zoom or anything. That's just one of the fora for doing that. There are lots of other ways that online learning can actually take place at the moment. And again, as we said with everything else, our role as governors is actually just to be aware of how the school is actually ensuring that learning is actually continuing at the current time, and to have a rough idea of actually what that entails, and to ensure that, of course, appropriate safeguards have actually been put in place for pupils, but also for staff as well. Okay, so just a few bits to say on online safety, because as we anticipated, there are a lot of questions actually coming in on this at the moment. So let's just go through this slide, then we'll come back to those questions if we may. Some of the considerations, of course, as far as online safety are concerned, and some of these do relate to the schools using online platforms for communicating with children. We do need to make sure that appropriate filters and monitoring systems are in place. So, you know, have we got safety security controls on these platforms that we're doing? Have they been put in place? Are we giving appropriate guidance to parents in terms of how to put those parental controls on themselves? The whole idea of adult supervision does not go away just because children are actually at home. As I think most people would be aware, there are many devices on the market, from mobile phones up to PCs, tablets, etc., and all of those gaming devices in the middle, that do not come with factory settings set with parental controls already on. They have to be put in place by parents or carers. We should still, as governors, be ensuring as part of safeguarding that we're actually reminding parents of that. One of the things that schools are actually being asked to think about is that, where we have children in schools at the moment, what access are they actually being given to to equipment within the school? So of course the whole bit about the filters and monitoring systems and the adult supervision comes into rather sharper focus there, of course, as does the last bullet point, which is about, have we got somebody in school who can provide technical support if something does go wrong, if something does happen from a security perspective that compromises the school's ability to allow children online access during the day when they're in school. And then of course that's mirrored on the bottom part of the slide here by what we should be perhaps putting in place in terms of just raising awareness and ensuring parents are mindful of those risks of increased internet access at home, not just from the online learning platforms, but also from other ways in which staff are keeping in contact with their pupils. One of the things to contemplate there, which I think is something that unions are quite rightly very aware of, is the risk that this does put staff at. There's guidance on where you should actually locate yourself. Can you have a background that blanks out the your home environment, but also things about recording. This is personal data. Unless you give as a teacher or anybody else for that matter, unless you give your permission, it's actually a data protection issue if somebody records that. But any recordings made can come back to haunt people in years to come. So there are some significant concerns there. But of course, overall, for whether children are at home or in school, what we should be seeking assurance of as governors is that appropriate support is put in place to keep children safe online, both for children, young people themselves, and of course for their parents. A couple of questions here. We've got a question come from Tracy. Tracy saying, my concern is that we're reaching out to those children who we know are vulnerable, but we're not making contact either by call. Yes, Tracy, I think you're absolutely right. Schools can only do so much. As I said to you already, we are in one of my schools, we have staff actually going out to knock on certain doors, not every door, but where there are some very specific concerns. That's what's happening in those situations.
Yeah, I've had this similar situation with both the schools where I'm a board member. And I think we're seeing not exactly the same, but somewhat mirroring of those amazing care staff that ended up camping in the care homes grounds to shield their families and look after and do their job. I think some teachers have been going over and beyond in order to make sure that each of their class have had a contact. It may be with some kind of online platform that they have connected with their children with, or it may have been an email or even a telephone call to a student that they may not, I'm thinking of secondary in one instance, where they have not had contact or work is not being done at a sufficient level. So just checking that what you make an assumption about is actually the reality of the situation, because as I think the question indicates, personal circumstances in some cases have changed enormously in that 8-week period.
Indeed. We have a question here from Ricky. How do we tackle peer-on-peer bullying and abuse online during the crisis?
I would say that that is exactly the same as what we had in place before. If we are and we have, all our schools will have policies. There will have been some changes to this, and I think many schools will have sent information home to children. But if your safe adult that you connected with before was somebody in school, you've still got your designated safeguarding lead with availability. You've still got your whatever you had in place in terms of your anti-bullying policy in school. What might that look like, and how might a contact between a teacher and a pupil, or is there a reporting system, or is this something that has gone home to make sure that children feel that they can confidently address that? It will depend on the age of the child, obviously, and it will also then depend on the support of the parents. So it definitely can come back into this safeguarding element as well. If home is not a place where they feel that they can raise that, is there still a process, a procedure, a way of supporting that child from school? Because we should still be aware of that.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move on there to the next slide, which is about mental health. And Linda, I know you're going to talk to this one.
Apologies, I'd muted myself to cough and forgot that I had not turned the microphone back on. So at the moment we are towards the end of Mental Health Awareness Week, which started on Monday, and you may well have seen many messages in different ways through the media and on television and radio this week. I certainly have seen a number of those. There is a Children's Mental Health Week which happened in February, and you may be aware as a board that there were some things that were done with children and assemblies and things like that then. But I think it's important to raise mental health as a focus, because certainly the changes in the last 8 weeks have created more anxiety in many areas of the population, but particularly in children. And these are some of the things that a number of the organisations that work with children, including the NSPCC and the Mental Health Foundation, which runs the Awareness Week, or is running the Awareness Week at the moment. The theme this week is kindness, and I think we could all see why that is an important theme as we look at all the things that are happening in society. But these are children's reports of what they're most vulnerable to in terms of their mental health. So as you would expect, missing their friends and grandparents. Some have had opportunities supported by their parents to have virtual conversations with their friends, but not all of them have been that fortunate. There are many children living in vulnerable circumstances, and those have been exacerbated by having to stay at home, by possibly a reduction in income and possibly environmental circumstances at home that aren't ideal to being kept indoors for a long period of time. There are many young people and children with existing mental health conditions, and a number of these have been really challenging for young people to manage when they haven't had the opportunity to go to school, to be supported in a different environment, to get an education, and to get the medical support in the same way. Remember, many places not doing home visits, and some of these individuals will have been supported by community outreach and different programs. There's a lot of anxiety in children, even quite young children, about the pandemic and if they're going to get ill themselves. But the biggest issue is if they're frightened of losing somebody that they love within their family. And these are very real, and in some cases they have actually happened, and young people have had some real challenges about being able to grieve and recognise their feelings. And for many, this is a 14-year-old quote, the second from the bottom. 14-year-old girl, when she asked how she felt about it, she was angry, fed up and isolated. And I think many of us would be able to identify with that. There's been, as I said earlier, 33% increase in calls to Childline since lockdown. Many are around that first issue of missing their friends, not being able to speak to their friends. But there have been some very notable calls about increases in violence at home. that vulnerable issue. So I think when we're thinking as governors, most of us will have a value within our schools or academy vision and ethos that is something around kindness, respect, kindness itself, compassion. And I think when we're moving forward with any of our governance, schools are very much taking into account trying to understand a wide range of viewpoints and deal with kindness in both dealing with parents and the wider community, and then in putting in place programs that will recognise that children with mental health problems, children may have developed some anxiety, and these will need to be factored in when children come back to school, and where we are aware as a school in the conversations, the way in which we're approaching this whilst the children are not at school, getting support or providing signposting to support where a situation is growing.
A couple of questions just coming before we move on here, Linda. And one question from Julie saying, do we think there'll be an increase in disclosures when children return to school? And what do we need to do about bridging the gap between school and those who don't meet the threshold for social care? I think two parts to that, or to the answer to that question. The first one is the second part of it in terms of not meeting the threshold. As Linda said earlier, that does not change from the situation pre-lockdown, where schools have got concerns. They should be logging those. They should be putting appropriate support mechanisms in place for those children. And as I say, that doesn't change. That's just business as usual, whether the children are in school or not. But there should still be that dialogue between the designated officers in local authorities, contact centres for reported concerns, etc. That will still be going on between designated safeguarding leads and other agencies. As far as what do we think about the number of disclosures, I think it's entirely possible. I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But certainly schools will be preparing themselves now, specifically on things that Linda's just talked about, mental health well-being issues that we know are a concern for children and young people at the moment. Schools are having to think about, okay, children, it's been a big change being at home for most of them for a long period of time. For those who've been in school, it's been a very different environment to what they're used to. There will be a period of readjustment, and readjustment will need support for a lot of children. So that could see an increase in referrals in disclosures, sorry. We've got one more question coming on attendance here. Just to make it very clear that at the moment, the government are saying that it is for parents to decide if their child goes to school or not. The only exception is children that are have an allocated key worker from children's social services or children's services in your areas. They are expected to be in schools, and that's for schools to liaise with social care to monitor. At the moment, we don't know how long it's going to go on. Everybody else, it's up to their parents whether they send them to school or not, and that includes those other vulnerable children, those with the HCPs, etc. Whilst the government thinks it's preferable for them to be, parents may disagree, and it's parents' right to do that. Okay, let's just move on. We've got one more poll that we'd actually like to ask you to engage in, if we could. And I say, just to remember, folks, this time, if you're in full screen mode, just reduce your screen size to just click the middle button. That should enable you to actually participate in the poll. I'm going to launch that poll now, and again, I'm going to have to hand over to Linda because I don't have the screen view that you've got at the moment this morning for some reason.
Yes, it's online, and if you click any that apply, so not just one, but any that apply in your particular circumstances.
Okay, we've got about 20% of people have voted so far, so that's great, but keep those votes coming in, folks. Just whilst people are voting, there's a question coming from Steve now, Linda, which you may want to think about. Steve's saying, at present, we can see the impact of youngsters being angry and a sense of isolation. So how can we as governors help to ensure there's an ease of self-isolation when back to school environment where social distancing is strongly put in force? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the planning documents that the government have issued to heads, they do cover this issue of mental health, and they do ask schools to plan for it. There is also training for staff, so there is an expectation that before we launch back into the children arriving in school, staff will have had some training about expectations of how to manage the social distancing themselves. Now, I'm not a head teacher, nor would I try and tell either of my head teachers how to do this, but I'm sure some of the thinking, and certainly in the conversations with both, has been around, well, the first few days back at school is all about reacquainting yourself with the relationships with your friends and your head teacher. And it may be that you're in a small group now, and that group is only able to associate with that group. And it's all about how you manage in this new world. So I think those conversations, that planning, those first few days in school will all about be introducing in a positive way children to the benefits of being back in school, but also the adjustments to doing school in a different way, whilst recognising for the very smallest children that social distancing isn't going to be something they're going to be able to do, but the protection comes in having that small group that only mixes with each other. But it's all contained in the guidance. It's not for us to make operational decisions, but I am absolutely positive that head teachers will consider this carefully when they're looking at what those first few days of school look like for different groups of children. I mean, year 6 children are going to have a very different focus when they come back, because it's all about transition for them and saying goodbye to their friends and reacquainting themselves with those relationships. For the children that are new to your school at the bottom end, it's going to be an entirely different process to take into consideration. So I think that planning is uppermost in most senior leaders' mind at the moment.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. Okay, we'll close the poll there and publish those results, which this time I can see them. So just very quickly, we've got top to 75% and 77%, so virtually equal, saying safeguarding is a routine agenda item in your virtual meetings. That's excellent. Others are covered in head teacher reports. Nearly 40% of you get a regular update from the designated safeguarding lead, which is good. 36% safeguarding governor report, and 7% our board hasn't so far. If you're part of that 7%, I would suggest, just in terms of accountability, that's something that you do need to think about. So that might be something to actually take back to your school and actually have a discussion about. Okay.
I might just make one point there in that support of it might be just a very small minority of board members that haven't discussed it so far. I know that some multi-academy trusts have collapsed their local board member meetings and are only holding trust board meetings, or they're engaging in a slightly different way. So if that applies to you and that's the reason, then you know that the trust is picking that up on your behalf. But for everyone else who has met in a virtual meeting, safeguarding is expected to be a regular agenda item. So there should be some kind of reporting that goes alongside that, and some kind of assurance discussion from the board's point of view to make sure that they have covered that adequately.
Okay, let's move on now. Well, where the time is actually getting on. So just a few suggestions for questions that we might want to reflect on as governors. These are all common sense and have come up as we've gone through the session this morning, hopefully. First and foremost, those changes that we talked about in government guidance, and some of you will have had that from your local authorities or perhaps from your multi-academy trusts. Has that been reflected in perhaps an addendum to the school safeguarding or child protection policies? If not, have procedures actually been amended to reflect that? That's something that we should be looking at. Have we provided guidance to staff and to pupils and to parents as well, for that matter, on online safety during the lockdown and the changed perhaps use of our schools? As you might expect, we do think that focus on vulnerable children is an important one, and that's something that if we haven't tackled in our governing body meetings till now, that's something that again we ought to be thinking about. And that last one, mental health. Have we focused on mental health and well-being, especially this week of all others, but it's not germane to this week at all. We should be concerned about the mental health and well-being of our pupils without any doubt whatsoever. And of course, don't forget, as governors, we have a duty of care for staff too, so we should be asking about their well-being as well. Couple of questions have come through about bereavement as far as mental health is concerned. Yes, there will be families, there will be children, there will be staff, there'll be lots of people who have been touched by bereavement during this crisis, and schools should be mindful of that, and schools hopefully will have adequate planning in place to actually deal with all issues relating to the crisis when children and young people do come back to school. I think we will see perhaps a disproportionate amount of time, but quite rightly, being focused on PSHE, personal social health education for children, and giving them the opportunity to talk about their feelings, as Linda was saying a few moments ago. Okay, well that just about brings us to the end of what we wanted to say. We've got a few questions coming here at the moment, and let me just pick a couple of those. I'm just very mindful of the time. Terry is asking a question: safeguarding for staff, as the government guidance now includes face masks for shopping, etc. Should staff be allowed, if staff want to? If they aren't allowed and they go on to contract COVID, will we be held accountable? I think that's a question that's on a lot of head teachers' minds. It's on a lot of governors' minds at the moment. Maintained schools are insured against public liability by their local authority, and multi-academy trusts have a statutory duty to put insurance in place. That's not, excuse me, that's not the full answer to the question, of course, but all we can do is ensure that risk assessment is actually being put in place for a return to school if that happens on or after the 1st of June. Our job as governors is to ensure that that is reasonable. And I'm sure we've got one or two lawyers in the webinar this morning. Reasonableness is the legal test here, of course. If you followed the DfE guidance, if you followed a guidance from your local authority, your borough council, or your multi-academy trust, those are all good indicators of reasonableness. And of course, don't forget, there isn't individual liability here because the governing body is a corporate body. Therefore, it is important that discussions are minuted, and that is a permanent record of the meeting of the governing body. But this is about, risk assessment isn't about making risk go away, it's about recognising risk and putting reasonable steps in place. So I hope that's some reassurance there for you, Terry.
The guidance is quite clear there as well for planning at this stage. The guidance it identifies staff who may be in that had a letter from the doctor stage, which is clear that they won't be back in school, but it's then that next group, and that they are advising that individual discussions are had between the member of staff and the senior leadership team about what would be the most suitable way for them to be able to do their job. And there is some examples and some suggestions within that guidance. And I know heads have already, they haven't waited till the guidance has been issued before doing those risk assessments on the staff and their staff's personal circumstances. And so many conversations have already been taking place in response to this. And, you know, if you've got a member of staff who has a hearing loss, for example, if other people are wearing masks, they will not be able to do the lip reading. So it's not simple. It has to be individual case by case discussions.
Yeah, and I think on that one, again, there will be advice from unions. That's for members of unions to decide whether they wish to follow it or not. And schools will be thinking about a whole range of different considerations. Certainly, if you read the government guidance on this, and it's available for everybody to see, the main consideration is actually about that maintaining social distancing. people have to make up their own minds on an individual basis, of course. I am very mindful, folks, that we have actually exceeded our time allocation this morning. You've got a couple of links there in terms of further information. These are the two documents that we've actually referred to this morning. You can follow those links. They are dynamic documents, they are updated, and we are expecting, because half term for an awful lot of the country starts at 5 o'clock tomorrow, or probably 3:30 tomorrow afternoon, I guess. So probably there will be something going on tomorrow. It's a good idea to actually watch out for these things. And that just brings us to the end of what we wanted to say, other than a very big thank you to you for joining us this morning. If we didn't answer your question or acknowledge your question individually, please don't think us rude. We had a huge number of people on the webinar this morning, but I hope we've actually managed to gather a lot of those questions into themes, etc., and responded. We will analyse all the questions after the event. If there's any we don't think we have actually responded to, we'll get back to you with an email. But thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar for Governors for Schools that we'll be hosting in the near future. Many thanks indeed. Have a good day.